This is Generous Theology, and today Chuck and Brock are taking a look at Professor Black's work in Chapter 23, The Nature of Intellect, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
I know that's a terribly complicated question to ask, so I'm going to just put you on the spot and maybe ask it in a yes or no question, knowing that neither answer without careful qualification is really fair. So Chuck, yes or no?
I'm not going to answer it as yes or no. I'm not very good at following instructions. But I do think so. There are some interesting things that come out of that. You've pointed out that there can be lengthy periods of time in which you're following a particular way of being, ways of thinking that sort of generally follow, and then they can change rather quickly. And I think that is an important point. I think that can happen. And I think we do see some of that throughout history. In fact, there are some historians who tell the story of history through these great disruptions. It is in these great disruptions that new things happen. And I think there are historians now who use that sort of theory, or even, I haven't read his book, but there's, I think his name is Francis Fukuyama, who has this thesis about the end of history. And I think that is, as I understand it, without having read it directly, but rather reading about his thesis, it is a sense in which what he is saying somewhat the same thing, that the end of history is really about that there is this great disruption that we're seeing now, in which sort of what has come most recently prior, a fairly lengthy period of time, maybe going back to medieval or even towards the late ancient times, that there is this coming switch, that we may be in the end of history as we know it because it's the beginning of another era. I think that thesis that things can suddenly change rather quickly can be true. And in fact, in our own history of Christianity, we see that. How quickly did Christianity spread? The Christians went from being this, tiny group, a branch of these zealot Jewish thinkers, to suddenly, only a couple hundred years later, being if not the majority religion in a large swath of the world, at least the predominant, the most one that had the greatest influence. So we see that there's some truth to that. The flip side of that I would add is that there are always layers of complexity to that as well. And we often can see, even in those great upheavals, we can see some threads that will last through, or we can see, looking back, we can see where some of those upheavals came from. And you and I have talked about this a little bit, even in terms of this book, where we had a while back, we had read through some 19th century philosophy, and there's a real sense that the 19th century philosophers thought that they were doing something brand new, that they were the smartest guys ever because they came up with all these great new ideas that nobody else had thought of, how much better they are than what came before. And yet we, from our perspective, have been able to see how, even in some of this medieval philosophy, even in some of the discussions of moving from more of a Platonic way of looking at the world to a more Aristotelian way of looking at the world, and some of the changes that occurred in the Middle Ages, from whether it's some of the older medieval folks or even Aquinas, but then later there's people like Occam and others who challenge some of their thinking, that we already see some of the seeds of what comes later in that. So there are also, I think it is useful to also think through the bigger picture and how do some of these things flow through. Specific to Islam, I think it's interesting. I know that it can be difficult because in the power in the Islamic world seems to be between two poles, two very fundamentalist poles, your Saudi pole, the Wahhabist, and then the Iranian pole with this very fundamentalist version of Shiism. But there are other traditions in Islam as well. And it's interesting to me that in these modern views of Islam that tend to be very fundamentalist in very many ways, whether it's the Wahhabists or the Iranian Shiism, that there are many Islamic scholars that I hear about who say, look, this doesn't represent the history of Islam. This doesn't represent that flowering of Islamic tradition that took place in places like Baghdad and during the time frame that we're reading about, or even early, just prior to the time that we're reading about in our books. And there's a sense where that even in Islam, we've seen sudden changes that have come about in how Muslims think about the Islamic religion and what is acceptable in the Islamic religion based on these geopolitical factors that have taken over. What maybe it's the power of the Wahhabists and the Shiites because they just happen to be sitting on top of huge amounts of oil. And if that hadn't happened, maybe other Sufis or some other strange strains of Islam might be more powerful. But I think that's also an important piece to see that we are so impacted by the course of history that things can suddenly change based on not only factors within, but factors from without as well. So those are all important things to consider that we can think about based on not so much the content of the chapter, but the historical context that we're really working with here. And frankly, I think one of the strengths, I think we mentioned this last week too, one of the strengths of Black's chapter is that she does deal with that historical context.
I love the balance here in considering just what it means for a culture to be a culture and for these culture wars to be occurring. I think of what I've largely talked about with you. We've both talked about, I should say, this marketplace of ideas. And it's no surprise to the student of history that cultures tend to go from the simple to the sophisticated over time. And it tends to be a new culture takes root, takes hold. And that culture can be characterized in a large sense as something new, as maybe on the historical scene something undeveloped, in the sense that not everything has been fully talked through. And then over the centuries, the culture has those discussions and people are talking through it. This marketplace of ideas emerges where you bring your ideas to the table and I bring my ideas to the table. They interact, they intermix, then they interact and mix with our tradition and our culture, and the culture moves forward. Now, of course, I'm purposely keeping separate here the Christian understanding of divine revelation, which really plays a much different role than that. But in this marketplace of ideas, we see how things play out and how civilizations play out. And so in the Islamic world, when Islam appears, it does appear as a new thing. The new thing is largely religious in nature, and Islam, in some sense, on a philosophical level, on a cultural level, is made up very much still constituted by the Greek world and the Jewish world that it consumed, that it devoured, if you want to use that sort of language. And so when the Christian West was in its Middle Ages, working through what some people like to call the Dark Ages, there are reasons, of course, to think of those as Dark Ages. There was still a high level of culture in the Middle East, in the Islamic world, and of course, abutting right next to the Islamic world was the remnants of the Roman Empire in the East, the Byzantine Empire, and they contributed greatly to that culture. In some sense, if you were going to look, if you and I time traveled and we went back to the world in that time and we desired to be in a more sophisticated cultural place, maybe more urbane, more sophisticated, more cultured, then perhaps we might go to the East. And I think people in the West felt that. And so over the centuries, as the West interacts with the East, that Aristotelian, Platonic remnants of the Greek ethos, let's put it that way, was developed. And in the West, there was nothing similar. And so when Aristotle is largely rediscovered by the Christian West, the first wave was through the Islamic influences. And there's a reason why we're not digging into the meat of what Islamic philosopher A said and philosopher B said. And I'll talk about that in a moment. It's on purpose, and it's not meant to be a pejorative in passing that material over. But you have this interaction where the West comes to the table in this marketplace of ideas with the Islamic, the formerly Greek, the formerly Judaic East, and you have this rediscovery of Aristotle. And what was needed in the West from a cultural point of view was that Aristotle was an improvement over much of the naive or default philosophical tradition that was in the West. And we could call this a Platonic Augustinianism. I'm not certain that was ever a an intention of that tradition to grow in that dimension. So nonetheless, as Aristotle is rediscovered in the High Middle Ages and reintroduced, it comes from an Islamic source. And even as these Aristotelian ideas pique the interest of thinkers in the West, there's still that stigma of not being in our tribe. The Islamicists are not part of us, and to maintain our cultural identity and our distinctiveness, we in the West must reject. At least that's how many people thought and felt. And so the middle ground here is that someone in the Christian West could synthesize and build an Aristotelian Christianity. And so we have in this High Middle Ages period, the scene is perfectly set for Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas. And indeed, that's what Deborah Black offers here, is that these Islamic thinkers impact the West. The reintroduction of Aristotle makes a difference. Even as the Christian West wants to push away from that foreign cultural tradition, it still also wants to, in some sense, work with it. And along comes Albert the Great, and along comes Thomas Aquinas, as the real Middle Age beginnings of what will later become scholasticism. And that's a pretty interesting movement in history, to think of Aquinas as a mediating compromise between completely excluding sophisticated philosophic theories in the West and completely embracing the Islamic developments from the East. Does that seem like a fair account here for how Blacks portrayed it to you, Chuck? How did that read?
Yeah, I think so. One thing that I would point to in that she specifically wrote in the first paragraph on her section on medieval Christian philosophy and the encounter with, she points out how Christian authors, as they come across some of these ideas, and here she's talking specifically about Avicenna's emanationist account of knowledge acquisition, this idea that we acquire knowledge through these emanations. She points out that you have these scholars who learn of this idea, and Avicenna obviously proposing this idea, he is interpreting Aristotle and Aristotle's ideas of knowledge acquisition, and they see that you can draw some parallels with what Augustine talks about with divine illumination. And so that then gives an opportunity then for Christian thinkers to say, aha, there might be something here. Let's look at this. And people like Aquinas, as you describe them, are these mediating figures who can mediate between these ideas, and either whether it's mediating the ideas to come up with something in between, or whether it's even something brand new in a way, but that comes out of this meeting of ideas. And it's clear, for example, just even in this idea of the intellect, that you have this meeting of Avicenna's view and Augustine's view, and there's enough similarity there that then people like William of Auvergne and later Aquinas and others are able to take this idea and say, hey, look, we can see Avicenna himself might be Islamic, but we can see some correlation with Christian ideas here. So she even mentions that later on, there are medieval thinkers who take this idea of the agent intellect that Avicenna really promoted and say, hey, Avicenna didn't think of this as being God, but we can see that this is God. So sort of.
Are you there, my friend? You went on mute. I can't hear you, my friend.
Yeah, I wonder whether it stopped when my phone rang, and I'm not sure whether I kept talking through the phone ringing for a little bit, but I'm not sure if I lost it there. But yeah, just to finish up, just this idea, these two ideas coming together into a new way of thinking, and how even later, we haven't gotten to this chapter yet, but she describes how this combination of ideas, this Avicenna's emanationist account and the Augustinian doctrine of divine illumination, leads some thinkers eventually to identify Avicenna's idea of the agent intellect as being related to God himself.